Annuncio vobis gaudium magnum. Habemus Papa.
On the evening of March 13th, 2013, in St. Peter's Square, the Catholic world welcomed a pope who came from the end of the world.
Fratelli e sorelle, buonasera.
After more than 1,300 years, a pope from outside Europe is chosen. The first pope from the Americas, the first Jesuit, and the first to take the name Francis. A responsibility that for 2,000 years no one had dared to take on. Admired by many and despised by others.
Some even saw him as the Antichrist.
He was a revolutionary pope, a progressive who sought to reform the church, standing close to the marginalized and open to interreligious dialogue, especially with Islam and Judaism. Because of his name, Pope Francis was called the Pope of the Poor. Jorge Mario Bergoglio was born on December 17, 1936, in Buenos Aires, to a family of Italian origin. His parents were both second-generation Argentinians. The migrant roots would always be a characteristic of the young Bergoglio, who grew up in close contact with the Italian community in Argentina. In 1925, the arrival of over 200,000 Italian immigrants in Buenos Aires was recorded, and often, the dream of seeking fortune elsewhere clashed with the tragedy of the journey. Bergoglio's sensitivity to this issue would be a defining feature of his papacy. Pope Francis placed immigration at the heart of his social agenda. He even made his first trip outside the Vatican as Pope to the island of Lampedusa to remember the thousands of lives lost in the Mediterranean. But before discussing his papacy, we first need to understand the context in which Jorge Bergoglio grew up and the four essential moments of his life. The influence of the dictatorship in Argentina, the crossroads period in Cordoba, his relationship with Latin America, and his election as Pope. Jorge Bergoglio was a young Jesuit, 40 years old, when in 1976 a coup d'etat brought Jorge Videla and his generals to power. This marked the beginning of the Argentine dictatorship, with the military junta remaining in power until 1983. These were the years of the desaparecidos, those who were disappeared and eliminated, all political opponents. Among the desaparecidos was Esther de Carriaga, a biomedical researcher and Bergoglio's first employer when he worked in a chemical laboratory. Esther was a left-wing political activist. Bergoglio would later recount how he helped her hide all her Marxist books, as they were illegal at the time. Esther was kidnapped and disappeared, along with 30,000 other Argentine desaparecidos. During those same years, Bergoglio interceded with Videla for the release of two Jesuits, Father Orlando Iorio and Father Franz Hallex, who had been captured by the military. After 5 months of torture, the two religious figures were released. But there were those who would accuse Bergoglio of not doing enough. Thus began a sort of dark tale that portrayed him as a double dealer. To overcome the trauma of those years, Bergoglio turned to a psychiatrist. At 54 years old, Jorge Bergoglio was sent into exile in Cordoba, a quiet city in the heart of Argentina. The reason? He had taken a firm stand against liberation theology, a movement he believed replaced prayer with politics. His stance didn't sit well with his superiors. To silence his voice and temper his growing influence, they decided to remove him from the spotlight. Liberation theology was gaining momentum at the time, a bold, socially charged approach to Catholic thought that placed the Church at the center of contemporary society, emphasizing justice, equality, and political liberation as core parts of the Christian message. From 1990 to 1992, Bergoglio lived what he would later call his dark night. It was a time of deep isolation and enforced silence, a spiritual exile as much as a physical one. He was cut off from power, from influence, from the path he thought he was meant to walk. And yet it was in that darkness that a light finally broke through. In the silence of Cordoba, Bergoglio had a profound realization, one that would change the course of his life. Humanity is never beyond redemption. No sin is too great. No soul is too far gone. Everyone, he came to believe, can find their way back. That moment marked a turning point. From then on, his heart turned more and more toward the peripheries, to the poor, the forgotten, the wounded, those most in need of the church's presence. His message shifted. His mission evolved. And in the quiet exile of Córdoba, a future pope began to take shape. In 1992, Cardinal Antonio Quaracino, the Archbishop of Buenos Aires, chose Bergoglio to be his close collaborator. On June 27th of that year, Jorge Mario Bergoglio was ordained auxiliary bishop in the Cathedral of Buenos Aires. At his ordination, he chose a motto that would follow him for the rest of his life: Miserando atque eligendo. The phrase, taken from Saint Bede, roughly translates as, by having mercy by choosing him. It would later appear on his papal coat of arms, a reminder that God's mercy was the foundation of his pastoral mission. It didn't take long for Bishop Bergoglio to make an impression. He became known for two defining traits: his deep connection to the people and his strong sense of national identity, which led him to speak out against all forms of colonization. On the anniversary of Argentina's defeat in the Falklands War against Margaret Thatcher's United Kingdom, he publicly honored the fallen soldiers, firmly declaring that the Falklands belonged to Argentina, not Britain. His focus on society's margins was deeply inspired by Argentine philosopher Emilia Pedetti, who helped shape his vision of a reborn Latin America, one rooted in its own identity and culture, pushing back against the tide of global homogenization. For Bergoglio, globalization represented the most dangerous form of modern totalitarianism, one that reduces human beings to mere economic output. Then came a major turning point. In 2001, Pope John Paul II elevated Bergoglio to the rank of cardinal. Soon after, he was also chosen as the head of Argentina's Bishops' Conference. At the heart of his agenda, the plight of the poor. That same year, Argentina declared bankruptcy. The country plunged into economic collapse, political instability, and widespread social unrest. In an interview, Bergoglio stood by his people, denouncing the crisis as a form of financial terrorism. He saw the urgent need for the church to awaken its social conscience, and he knew the responsibility started with him. His name began circulating widely among bishops across Latin America. This was a time of great upheaval across the continent. In Rome, the Second Vatican Council had opened the door to new relationships between Catholicism and modernity. Bergoglio became a leading voice for the theology of the people, a cultural and spiritual response to injustice that didn't reduce the masses to a social class, but saw them as a people, a nation, capable of building a different kind of society rooted in gospel values, not market logic. The real turning point came in 2007 at the 5th General Conference of Latin American Bishops in Aparecida, Brazil. Bergoglio was entrusted with helping draft the final document, but it was his homily on May 16th that made history. It was the only one to receive a standing ovation from the entire assembly. In that speech, Bergoglio laid the groundwork for the future direction of his pontificate. A missionary church, open and universal, built in partnership with the faithful people of God. If the Latin American church had been born through the exploitation of native peoples, then the universal church must ask forgiveness and devote itself to serving the marginalized. He warned that the church must never forget the sobrantes, the leftovers cast aside by the market economy. He stood against what he called the culture of waste, a system that discards the poor, the vulnerable, children, and the elderly as if they were disposable. The election of Pope Francis in 2013 caught the world by surprise. Even analysts didn't see it coming. Time magazine had tipped another Argentine as the frontrunner, Cardinal Leonardo Sandri. But behind the scenes, a different story was unfolding. In a book published years later, Francis himself explained how the voting worked. In the early rounds, undecided cardinals cast what are called deposit votes, choosing friends or safe candidates unlikely to win, just to get a feel for the room. But by the fifth ballot, the tide had turned. Jorge Mario Bergoglio was elected with 85 votes out of 115. As he sat in quiet shock, Cardinal Claudio Humes, a fellow Latin American, leaned in and whispered, "Don't forget the poor." That sentence would define the papacy that followed. In honor of that mission, Bergoglio chose the name Francis, after Saint Francis of Assisi. But the surprise wasn't just in the name. What came next shook the very image of the papacy. Francis chose simplicity over splendor. He wore a plain white cassock without the traditional velvet mozzetta or golden vestments. Around his neck he placed a simple cross made of alpaca, the same one he wore when he became a bishop. That night, standing on the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica, he didn't give a grand speech. He asked the people to bless him first. Then came the decision that made headlines. He refused to live in the Apostolic Palace. Instead, he moved into Casa Santa Marta, a modest residence built by John Paul II, part guest house, part hospice for elderly clergy. For Francis, the towering pyramid of power in the Vatican, with the Pope above all, was something to be flipped on its head. He wanted a church that returned to its roots, not a throne, but a community. In his eyes, the real sickness of the church was clericalism, that mix of arrogance and superiority that separates clergy from the people. Between 2013 and 2020, Francis used the word clericalism 55 times. Benedict XVI had used it once in 7 years. Francis was not just preaching change, he was building it. In 2022, he replaced the Constitution of the Roman Curia, written in 1988 by John Paul II, with a new one, Predicit Evangelium. Its mission, to realign the church with its original calling, to be missionary. At its center stood the dicastery for evangelization, a kind of super ministry, and a new dicastery for charity, tasked with helping the poor around the globe. He also reformed the powerful dicastery for the doctrine of the faith, once known for silencing theologians and banning books. Under Francis, it began to include the Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors. He knew the time had come to confront the Church's darkest scandal: abuse. In 2019, he gathered bishops from around the world for a summit on abuse. For the first time, victims were given the central voice. Soon after, he abolished the pontifical secret in cases of sexual abuse. He issued a decree holding bishops and religious superiors accountable for covering up abuse. No longer could silence protect the guilty. He admitted his own failures too, like in Chile, where underestimating abuse cases led to the mass resignation of the country's entire episcopate. Francis also asked forgiveness on behalf of the Church for the forced conversions and abuses inflicted on indigenous peoples. In Canada, where the government called the actions of Catholic-run residential schools a cultural genocide, Francis responded with humility and sorrow. For Francis, religion must be a force for peace, and only a non-European pope could have opened the doors to real dialogue with Islam, stepping past decades of misunderstanding shaped by extremist violence. His first trip outside the Vatican was symbolic. He went to Lampedusa Island. Just months earlier, 368 migrants had drowned off its coast. Standing by the sea, he mourned what he called a cemetery without tombstones. He kept with him, and still does, the life vest of a small girl who died in the waters off Lesbos Island in Greece. His message to the world: solidarity with migrants and refugees. In 2019, in Abu Dhabi, he signed the document on human fraternity with the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar. That same year, he addressed Christians in Morocco, emphasizing peaceful coexistence. In 2021, in Iraq, he met with Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani in the holy city of Najaf. In 2024, in Jakarta's Istiqlal Mosque, he signed another declaration of fraternity, this time with Imam Nasruddin Umar. The Mediterranean, he said, must not become a graveyard of indifference. Once a sea of memory, it must not become a sea of forgetting. He spoke out boldly, even against global superpowers. When the Trump administration began deporting refugees and undocumented migrants, Francis condemned the policy. He wrote directly to American bishops standing with the displaced. In his 12 years as Pope, Francis has become a global voice for peace and reconciliation, warning of what he calls a third world war fought in pieces. But his vision of peace is not utopian. It's rooted in fraternity. in dialogue that doesn't erase differences, but respects them. This is why he introduced the concept of integral ecology in his landmark encyclical Laudato Si. It wasn't just an environmental manifesto, it was a social one. For Francis, the climate crisis is a reflection of a deeper crisis, one within humanity. Ecological awareness, he said, connects us to one another and to the planet. Only when we realize we share a common home can we truly care for one another. In the end, Pope Francis has taken the Church far beyond the walls of religion. He's spoken with the voice of the gospel, not to Catholics alone, but to the world. He's been hailed as a rock star and criticized for his bold views. But one thing is certain. In 11 years, Francis has become more than a pope. He's redefined what it means to lead, not above the people, but among them.